Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Johnny Bruner Sr. Has always told the drivers, white flag is out, 1 lap to go, keep your eye on the rear vision mirror. He said it's extremely important. I don't believe that you have to tell Richard Petty to keep his eyes in the rear vision mirror.
I reckon he's throwing it out the window right now. I don't think he's even interested. But there they go, and they're coming.
Everybody is standing here at the Daytona International Speedway. Look at David Pearson. He has moved closer. Can he do it?
He's going to pull out now. He's going to try for the track.
I don't know. He's down on the inside. He's even. He's got the lead, but there's a car ahead of him. There is a slower car ahead of him. And Richard Petty and Pearson go high. Pearson now has the lead. Petty tries to go back down on the inside as they come out of the fourth turn. They only have about 750 yards to go. Oh! It's a domination straightaway. They did hit. Petty smashes into the wall. Will he come across the start-finish line? He's going to win the race. He's going to win it spinning, as he, I believe, will take the checkered flag. No, he did not make it. He is less than 100 yards from it. Here comes Pearson. Pearson is going to try to make it across the finish line. Petty has his car going. Pearson's going to win it. Oh, fashion triangle. He wins the race.
What a finish for a motorcycle. I've never seen anything like that.
It's unbelievable. Unbelievable, because here is Richard Petty, not more than maybe 150 feet from it.
He's got it started up, and he's crossed the finishing line as well.
He did it. He beat Betty Parsons across, so he gets second place.
But he's been pushed. There may be an infringement of the regulations there. He's been pushed. So it'll be interesting to see what the officials have to say about this. But what a spectacular finish. We'll have to look at that finish again, because it really was a question of Richard Petty and David Pearson really moving in on each other there in the most spectacular manner in the last corner of the racetrack.
It looked actually like a demolition derby. It looked as if the car that kept it moving was going to win it, and that's exactly what happened.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. How are you, everybody? It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. We appreciate it. And wow, we're racing down the annals of history this week as we go back into NASCAR. And we have our return guest. His name is Mike Hembree. You may remember him from our celebratory 300th episode when back in 2023, when we celebrated the 75th year of NASCAR with our great NASCAR 75 Years Roundtable, along with Kelly Crandall, Jimmy Creed, and Al Pierce. Check that episode out, because if you're relatively new or uninformed about NASCAR, you will enjoy not only that conversation, but the great book from which that conversation emanated. But Mike is back with his own book this week as we talk about an amazing battle between two of the most legendary names in NASCAR's history, that being Richard Petty, still with us, and David Pearson. And the book, of course, that you should get after listening to this episode. And you'll enjoy it thoroughly as I did, even if you're not a race fan. It's called Petty versus Pearson, the rivalry that shaped NASCAR. And hopefully you get a little bit of a sense. You can go to YouTube and see some more from that clip there. The sense of just how amazing these two guys were in battling each other. And as we get into the history of this with Mike in a few moments, Richard Petty, obviously known as the King, still around, legendary, perhaps the most famously known racer in all of NASCAR's history. It's arguable, but probably not too debatable. Most wins ever, 200. Most poles ever, 123. He's tied for the most Cup Series championships with 7. And he had 1,184 starts. So he won, 200 of those 1,184 starts. Pretty damn impressive, if you ask me. But David Pearson, equally prodigious and well-known and legendary. He was known as the Silver Fox. Pearson only started, by comparison, just not even half of as many races as Petty did. We'll talk about why with Mike coming up. He started, I think, 574 starts, but he won 105 of those. So his winning percentage was almost near 20%. So even though he raced half as much as Petty, he won at a greater clip. And there was no more exciting a battle when both Messrs. Petty and Pearson were in the same race, battling it out. And I think that was, they raced each other over 551 times. They raced against each other. They were in races together. And 63 of those times, they finished 1-2, meaning one finished first and the other finished second. Pearson won 33 of those and Petty 30. I mean, you could not define a more vivid and exciting and consequential rivalry than the contrasting styles of these two great racers, Richard Petty and David Pearson. And we're going to get into all of that. And what you heard there was a clip from the 1976 Daytona 500, probably their most famous finish between these two. Both of and you've got to see this on the audio doesn't do it full justice. You've got to go online and watch this. If you're not familiar with it, both drivers wrecked at the end of the race, and Petty's in the lead, yet he can't turn his engine back on, and he's literally, I don't know, maybe a few hundred feet away from the finish line. And sure enough, David Pearson, who was left for good behind in a wreck, the two of them still on the track, he somehow soldiers on and squeaks his way through before Petty can get his engine back on and wins that race. This was presaged a little bit by a similar race at Daytona, not the Daytona 500, but the July race when they had a second race in July called the Firecracker 400, and Pearson again somehow outfoxed Petty in the final laps. And I think that's kind of the race that established his nickname, the Silver Fox. But this is just an example, right? There were like 50 some odd other races where these guys were going at it, 60 some odd other races going at it. It's just amazing. And the tons of clips of this on there. But as you'll hear in our conversation with Mike, it is thoroughly enjoyable, not only for this battle royale between these two, but this conversation and this story between Messrs. Petty and Pearson is actually mimics and is kind of the subtle subtext, I guess, of the actual history of NASCAR itself in the late 1960s and 1970s, right? So if you're looking for a good understanding, sort of in metaphorical terms, about how NASCAR grew from sort of the southern roots and the regionality of it and into more of a national pastime and a phenomenon, and national television and all that kind of stuff. You will enjoy hearing this conversation with Mike Hembree as we talk about the battles between Richard Petty and David Pearson, really the story of NASCAR in the 1960s and 1970s. And again, that clip was from ABC's telecast. I believe it was Wide World of Sports. They had not sort of fully done race coverage at that time of the 76 Daytona 500. That was called Live, and that was Bill Fleming, if you remember that name from ABC Sports' past, along with Jackie Stewart doing the color commentary, and who you did not hear was the eminent pit reporter at the time, Chris Economaki. Great video. Go check it out. You will be glad you did. And you'll love this book, and I highly encourage you to get it. It's not only a great narrative with some just wonderful photos spread throughout the book, and again, it's called Petty versus Pearson, the Rivalry That Shaped NASCAR. It is available now wherever you get good books. It is published by, what is the name of it's called Motor Books, I think is the name of yes, that's the name of the publisher, Motor Books. And of course, if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and find this episode numbered 404 with our friend Mike Hembree and myself, you'll find a convenient link to a couple of links, actually, to our friends at Amazon to get either the hardcover, the Kindle, or the audiobook versions of this impressive book. And we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love for when you do so. We appreciate that. All right. So buckle up, as we said. Make sure the seatbelt is nice and tight, comfortable, however. Grab a tasty beverage and don your helmet, because here we go. We're going in. We're going to be talking about Petty and Pearson. Here's our conversation we had with Mike just about 2 weeks back. And as always, please enjoy. Remind our audience your background. You're probably the dean, if not one of the deans, of NASCAR racing reportage, perhaps even motorsports more generally. A little bit of background about you and your life with this sport, and then we'll get into the specifics of the story.
Well, I'm certainly among the old timers. I started in the spring of 1975. I haven't run straight through. There was about a 7-year period when I was away from racing, doing other things, features and general news coverage and general feature writing and so forth. But I have about 43 years in motorsports, most of it NASCAR related. Newspaper primarily, magazines, now, of course, websites. So I've been to thousands of races, and my hearing can vouch for that. Been around a lot of loud engines over the years. So,
but a lot of your background though was in this curious thing these youngins don't remember anymore, called newspapers, right? Newspaper writing, and I suspect also by extension magazine, the print world, if you will.
Yeah, I started working at my local newspaper when I was a junior in high school, and then went to journalism school at the University of South Carolina, and I worked full time at the newspaper there, the State, in Columbia, South Carolina, for 3 of my 4 college years. And then after graduation, just really jumped in with both feet. Worked at several newspapers, and NASCAR Scene, which was a weekly NASCAR magazine based in Charlotte, North Carolina. USA Today, NBC Sports, the Speed Channel. I've kind of been like a driver who couldn't stay with one team.
NASCAR Scene, by the way, was that evolved into Winston Cup Scene, right? Sort of as like a tabloid, kind of really thick paper, right? Every week.
Yeah. It was a tabloid. It was it was known as the Bible of NASCAR racing, basically. Started as a pretty small paper and just evolved over the years into what we always thought was a really fine publication, a state-of-the-art design and production, and we really had a great staff of writers. Unfortunately, it sort of went the way of other newspaper type products. In 2010, it was around for a while after that, website only. But yeah, I had 7 or 8 really good years there. One of the best jobs I ever had.
Fun fact, one of my previous jobs in my semi-illustrious marketing and advertising career was working at a credit card bank called MBNA America, which most NASCAR fans of a certain age, especially in the 90s, might remember as sort of the official NASCAR credit card company. Yes. You could get various drivers as your choice of card. We would go to various events. My first NASCAR race ever was a mid-1990s race. I think it was the fall race in Charlotte. Just blew my mind and just was just an amazing thing. But we also, having working in the in-house advertising department there, had the Winston Cup Scene folks on our speed dial, because we were putting full page ads and then some into that magazine on literally on a weekly basis. So I must say, I'm sure I enjoyed some of your writing in those years where that's how I learned about this thing growing up in the Northeast, the curiosity of NASCAR racing and all that. That was the that truly was a Bible for me, because I really got to learn all the ins and outs of it. In addition to just all the other, it added a whole lot of color to the races that I would listen to and watch, frankly, for the first time and somewhat naively.
Well, it was a very popular publication. We had a subscription base, so well over 100,000, which we were able to keep up even when the decline started. The real decline was in advertising revenue. And then when that happens, your pages shrink and your content is not as heavy, excuse me. But it really was a sort of a keepsake kind of thing for really diehard NASCAR fans, because we had tons of stats in there, and it was the kind of paper that people would read and then put back somewhere and keep in many households. So it was a great product, I must say, despite the fact that I was involved with it. But we had a really, really good time there and did some good work, I think.
Well, it certainly helped establish you even further, right? Especially on a national basis, right? All the the NBC stuff, et cetera. Let me segue into this particular story. You've written a ton about the sport and the people involved and the personalities and stuff. You were a guest of ours on our episode 300, our great roundtable on the 75th anniversary of NASCAR, celebrating that great book that the four of you produced, which is just the essential coffee table book for anybody who's new to the whole NASCAR thing. But it's, how does this story hit your radar? And maybe why has it taken so long, perhaps, to kind of have sort of the authoritative book about these two titans of NASCAR that arguably not only were constructed a great rivalry, but in many respects, I think most would suggest, I think you do too in the pages of this book, perhaps burnished and or created the foundation for the growth of NASCAR in the 60s and certainly in the 1970s.
Yeah, I think every significant sport to become very popular has to have a big rivalry. Lakers, Celtics, Colts, Packers. There has to be a winner and somebody to challenge that winner with some regularity. And NASCAR racing didn't begin until 1949, so we're talking about a relatively young sport. And through the 50s, the sport was kind of static. There were a lot of races every year, but there was only the Southern 500 at Darlington that was a really big race until 1959 when Daytona International Speedway came along and the Daytona 500 kicked off. It so happened with the arrival of Daytona, Richard Petty and David Pearson came along, got their careers started around the same time that track opened. So the sport's biggest track grew up sort of as Petty and Pearson grew into their careers through the 60s. They were the top drivers for most of those years. You could miss the first 3/4 of a race and pick it up, and to no surprise, it was Petty and Pearson battling in the last 100 laps of a race. Obviously, not every week, but often. So they became, the two titans of the sport over that period, and developed a very fierce rivalry. Not an ugly rivalry, but one that folks came to the track to see. It was no surprise to anybody when those two cars were running in the top five and the closing laps with the race about to be decided. And on 63 occasions, it was 1 and 2, Pearson, Petty, Petty, Pearson, depending on your perspective. Pearson, by the way, won 33 of those 63. A point that Pearson fans will point out many times if you give them the chance.
Well, but they also probably point out sort of some of the other statistics, and we'll go back to the origin story in a second. But One of the stats that sort of stuck out to me among the many. I mean, these guys are probably one of the best resumes you'll have in terms of championship driving. The percentage of winning, right? And again, you're talking about competing in a field of, high 30s, low 40s in terms of each race and stuff, right? So winning is a real achievement, week in and week out. But it's interesting, like just how many wins each of these guys had. Yet I think the Pearson fans would say he mostly ran part-time seasons versus Petty, who was running full-time seasons, and Pearson racked up nearly as many wins on a maybe smaller base of actual races competed in.
Yeah, Pearson's winning percentage was a bit better than Petty's, and those who followed Pearson and many of whom still consider him the best driver ever will tell you that, well, if he had run full time for more years, he would have won more than 3 championships. Petty, of course, won 7. But the fact is, Pearson did not run those seasons, so we'll never know how many championships he could have won. My thinking is that it certainly would have been, 5 or 6 at least. But back in the 60s, the championship was not nearly as important as it became when Winston Cigarettes arrived in the 70s, and that company brought a much bigger significance to the championship, looking at the whole year as opposed to individual races. It certainly was cool and important to win the championship in the 50s and 60s, but it became a much bigger thing starting in the 70s and obviously up to now. But certainly both were championship drivers of the highest order. Richard won his first one in 64 and his last one in 79. That's a pretty good span of championship driving. Pearson's came in 66, 68, and 69. So if you look at those numbers, either Richard or David won the championship in 5 of the 60s years. Pretty impressive when you're, as you mentioned, there are 38 to 43, 44, sometimes 50 cars in some of those fields.
Paint a picture for me and our listeners of what NASCAR was like in the late 50s, early 1960s when the King, Richard Petty, and the Silver Fox, David Pearson, were kind of coming into the scene, because I think it's important to kind of understand where NASCAR was around that time, because you mentioned some of the things. There are a couple of seeds there that were going to grow into something significant, but it was much, I don't know, would you call it a simpler time, but certainly a much more regional kind of endeavor versus anything approaching a national sport at that point.
Yeah, I compare it sort of to a county fair or maybe a state fair environment. Mostly dirt tracks, not near big cities for the most part. The races were more than a sports event. They were sort of a weekend festival, I guess you might say. It was sort of like the circus coming to town. There was almost no TV, so if you wanted to see these guys race, you tried to find a track you could drive to 2 or 3, 4 hours or whatever, and you showed up and wow, there they are. There was Petty and Pearson and Yarborough and guys you had read about in the newspaper and seen a few film clips of maybe here and there. Here they were in your town. And it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was like the fair coming through. It was a big deal.
But not an exhibition either, right? I mean, these were for stakes, if you will, and there were guys who were kind of looking at this as either for making a living or that they wanted to win prizes.
Yeah, absolutely. Money clearly was important. I mean, it was one of the things that got the Petties into the sport was the thing that, hey, we can make money doing this. We don't have to farm. We don't have to drive a biscuit truck or whatever. This is something real that we can make money from. Most of the drivers and teams in the 50s era, it wasn't their primary source of income. The purses were nothing to get too excited about in most cases, but all that built over the years, and it turned from this county fair environment that I've been trying to describe into much more of a business, much more of an entertainment thing that once you saw it and heard it and were around it, you wanted to do that again. You wanted to tell your friends about it. And of course, that eventually involved into getting it on television. And after that, it was Katie bar the door.
You mentioned how many times these guys raced against each other or were in races in the field against each other. And then just the astonishing amount of times that they would finish 1-2 in positioning. When did the rivalry kind of actually start to become a thing and maybe potentially gel in sports reporters' minds and stuff? We were also talking about a period where you just mentioned before, 1959 was sort of the advent or the birth of the first super speedway, if you will, in Daytona, right? So it's clear that the competitiveness of the racing was probably also starting to ratchet up a bit around their time, that they were cutting their teeth and making their marks. I'm just curious as to how those two evolved simultaneously, and when did these two kind of start to, if you will, stand out a bit?
Yeah, I would place that period probably 65 to 70. Richard had won the championship in 64. And he was with a very established team, his family-owned team. His father, Lee, had started it. David bounced around, drove his own race cars for a while, drove for a few underfunded teams, did not have anything like the resources that the Petties had. But he wins the championship in 66 with Cotton Owens' team based in Spartanburg, the same town David was from. And then hooks on with the famous Holman Moody team to win titles in 68 and 69. All that sort of set the stage for what would become the Petty-Pearson rivalry that most fans know the most about. That was when Richard was driving, of course, the 43 for Petty Enterprises, and David linked up with the Wood brothers to drive the almost equally famous number 21 Fords and Mercuries. That's when I think the peak of the Pearson-Petty rivalry just kind of jumped out at you. These are beautifully designed race cars. The two teams were talented in almost every way, in every team position. Best engine builders, best pit crews in the sport. Their cars lasted typically longer than most other teams. Were able to endure 400 and 500-mile races and still be on the lead lap. So I think from 65 to 70 is when that kind of started to build. And then in the 70s, it really became the thing that most folks remember as that rivalry.
But they were both quite different in their styles, though. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit without giving away too much, because the book is really solid in telling. But they're competitive, yes, but their approaches kind of to winning races and staying competitive are I don't know, starkly different, but they certainly are not similar.
Yeah, they were different in that way. Pearson figured out fairly early on that you didn't have to lead every lap to win a race. That's not to say in his early years he wasn't a bit of a hardhead, because he did. It took him a while to discover the fact that you don't have to be the top car every lap. And over the years, he fine-tuned that strategy into something that became his calling card. He would run 10th or 15th or 20th a lot of the race. He might drive up and challenge the leaders for a few laps and halfway through the race just to kind of see how they were and how his car compared to theirs. Then he would drop back again, 15th or whatever, 5, 10, 15 laps to go. He would run up toward the front and contend for the win, and often we get it. That's not to say that Petty was a sort of a hard charger driver in the Dale Earnhardt mode. Petty was calculating. He was slick. He knew that, particularly through most of the 60s, he was going to show up at every racetrack with one of the top 3 cars in the field. The Petty team's cars were just that good. So he knew he didn't have to break the car either, but he enjoyed running at the front. He liked to stack up laps led, when it was reasonable. He liked to race other people. Richard has said, many times, that the great joy for him in auto racing was the pure driving of the race car, being in the race car, behind the wheel, making it go fast. That was the joy for him, and that was the hardest part of him eventually giving up driving race cars. So they were different in that way, but it's not fair to say that Pearson was the sly fox, the silver fox who held back, and Richard tried to lead every lap. That wasn't the case either. But you'd more often find Richard up near the front for more of a race than you would Pearson.
In the 60s, though, do I have, I mean, I'm now projecting, I'm not sure if this is true. You would know. NASCAR hadn't really, from a competition perspective, evolved to the point where it rewarded as much for endurance and positioning than, say, than today versus, say, what I'm trying to get at. Winning a race seemed to have more outsized influence in terms of points and standings, I think, right back then versus today, where one is rewarded not only for that, but also various intermediary points during the race, like winning a stage here and there, or leading laps and that kind of stuff. Is that right, or am I making that up?
Well, for much of its history, NASCAR was pretty much all about what became known as point racing. It was essentially as important to finish 10 races in the top 5 as it would be to win 2 races out of 10 and finish, 20th or 30th in the others. Because the way the points were set up for many years, if you finished second and you also led the most laps in a race, you got as many points as the race winner did. And that lasted forever. And it made point racing very, very important across the landscape of particularly stock car racing, because other tracks that weren't necessarily NASCAR affiliated picked up this idea of, we want guys who are consistently good every week to do well at our track, versus some guy who wins a race, every 2 months and then doesn't do well the rest of the time. So point racing sort of became the concept. NASCAR has moved away from that over the past decade or two by making wins more important. You win a race now in the Cup Series, you're essentially in the playoffs at the end of the year. So winning, means a lot. So with Petty, the years that Petty and Pearson came along, this was the world they sort of came into, point racing. So it became important to be consistent as well as very good.
Well, which is also especially interesting in Pearson's case, because although he did race a few full seasons, he mostly did not, right? So he's in some respects his consistency is undermined by the fact that he's not racing a full season's worth of races.
Well, and it was a factor of money. The years he didn't run the full series, and he ran full seasons 3, maybe 4 times, depending on how you count things. But a lot of the short track races at tracks sort of out in the middle of nowhere didn't pay that much money to win, and you were showing up there and risking your race car. A lot of teams in those days had 1 or 2 race cars. You tear it up at some quarter-mile dirt track somewhere, you're out of a car for a while, or you got to work a lot to get it fixed. So Pearson and some other drivers decided, hey, we're just going to show up at the bigger tracks with the bigger purses and not worry about trying to race every week, or in some cases 2 or 3 times a week back in the early days. So that became a matter generally of money, and Pearson liked money, so he jumped on that bandwagon.
Yeah, well, that's convenient, right? But this also, though, comes against a backdrop, though, of what's also going on with NASCAR generally, right? In the 60s and certainly in the 1970s, when television really kind of became more of a component to that. But my guess is that you're starting to see some new facilities that are bigger. Certainly Talladega is another one. The expansion of existing ones like Charlotte and stuff into quote unquote super speedways and the like. I guess those marquee races becoming a bit more truly prominent and or winnings paying and oriented, as well as generating maybe a bit more excitement and attendance, and maybe even generating more curiosity outside of the solid South per se. I guess what I'm trying to sort of discern there is, it almost feels like the rivalry as it was developing almost was synonymous with the growth that the sport was exhibiting at the same time. I'm wondering, was there any cause and effect to this? Was the rivalry potentially an example, or perhaps maybe helping the case, or was it just sort of mutually synonymous and independent of each other?
Well, I think they went hand in hand. You talk to anybody who was around the sport a lot. In the 60s, one of the first things they will tell you is, this sport grew up on the back of Richard Petty. He was the guy in the 60s who was always available to sign every autograph, to meet every fan, to respond to every interview request, to stay at the track hours after races ended, signing every autograph. And that went hand in hand with Pearson coming along and providing the sort of the match point person for Petty, because you wanted a guy who won a lot, but you didn't want a guy that won every week. You wanted somebody up there to battle that person. Pearson became that guy for Petty, and as the sport grew and as TV came along, as Winston came along in the early 70s and dumped a boatload of money into the sport, and it really was a big boatload of money, made tons of difference to everybody and everything around the sport. So you had that automatic rivalry already in place, even as the sport was growing beyond the rivalry to, as you mentioned, new tracks like Charlotte, Rockingham, Atlanta, 1969 Talladega, the giant track in Alabama comes along, and speeds grow like crazy. Michigan comes along. So everything kind of folded in on itself over that, 65 to 75 period when Petty and Pearson were showing the way at most places.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. I guess Petty was probably the guy that most people just off the street, like if they weren't even NASCAR fans or didn't understand auto racing at all, they probably would have known that name, not unlike Pele or DiMaggio or somebody like that, right? Where it's almost synonymous and the curiosity, I guess, around that. And Pearson essentially becoming a literal rival to the guy everybody seems to know, whether they're a fan of the sport or not. That seems to be pretty synonymous and almost a snowball effect, I guess, in terms of attraction and interest.
Yeah, and this is where these two guys differed the most. As I mentioned earlier, Petty was tailor-made for a sport just kind of getting on its feet, and it needed that central important figure to kind of be the focal point of everything. And Richard understood that to the nth degree. He has often talked about, these people, these fans, they're the ones that pay my salary, and we need to keep them happy. And he has always gone out of his way to make that happen. He was a handsome kid coming into sport. He seemingly had 84 teeth in his smile, and his smile was perfect for television, perfect for newspaper shots. He famously would, as I mentioned, he cultivated relationships with media. And if a new reporter showed up who didn't know much about the sport, Richard would go so far as to make up questions for this person and kind of help him along with information he needed to know. Pearson, very much different in that way, and I address this extensively in the book. And I point out Pearson was not unfriendly. He was one of the guys. He got along with everybody, but he grew up very differently than Richard. Richard grew up in the sport from the time he could toddle around the shop. He was in there, probably creating trouble or whatever and stealing wrenches or whatever. Pearson did not have that advantage. He grew up in a textile mill village just outside the city of Spartanburg. He worked in that textile mill briefly. did not come from a well-to-do family at all, and he wandered over as a kid to watch races at the Spartanburg dirt track and became enamored of it, and worked his way into it. But he came in as a sort of a bashful person. He did not finish high school, so he was sort of shy about what he knew and what he didn't know. He was not comfortable around media people, particularly around TV cameras. He would find ways to avoid things like that, not because he didn't appreciate what was going on or he didn't like the reporters or whatever. He wasn't comfortable being in that environment. And Petty was just the opposite. That he loved all that and he understood it. More importantly, so that I think that's the primary difference in the two guys, particularly in the first decade of their careers.
I'm also curious though, how do these two guys competitively wind up standing out, right? I mean, you're mentioning Petty being fairly well situated in terms of a team and obviously there for just about every race. Pearson obviously a little less so, and the Wood brothers are a little smaller, sort of homespun kind of operation, falling out a little bit here and there, and it had partial seasons and that kind of stuff. I mean, but there were other, tremendous drivers both in the 60s and 70s. I mean, like in the 60s, Joe Weatherly before his tragic death in 64, and Ned Jarrett, and even a Junior Johnson before he became sort of a legendary team owner. And certainly in the 70s, people like Cale Yarborough, right? Most people remember Bobby Allison, Benny Parsons, and even like Darrell Waltrip at the end of the decade, sort of kind of coming into his own. What was about these two guys on the track that made them so darn consistent despite their differences? And so often, and literally at the end of the race, with 1-2 finishes. It just seems, it almost sounds rigged if you think about it.
Well, they had great race cars. Point one. You've got to have the car, you have to have the driver, you have to have the team, you need the good sponsors, you need the money behind everything. And they won races. They were in the top five more often than they were not. And it just became a natural thing to see the 43 and later on the 21, and before the 21, Pearson had great cars with Cotton Owens and with Holman Moody. So they were there. Every week that they both raced, they were there, leading laps, having good cars, winning pole positions. And as I've talked about, being around at the end of races, they rarely blew engines, they rarely fell out of races. They were there, and when that happens every week, or in David's case, every race in which he drove practically, people see that. They recognize that, hey, this guy is a winner. I want to follow him and see where he goes, what he does. And it became the case for both of them. And all that was burnished by the fact that for most of those years, Petty was a Plymouth guy, and Pearson was a Ford guy. And this is not so much the case now, but in those days, it really mattered what kind of car you drove. Fans were big Ford fans or big Chrysler fans or big Chevrolet fans. It was almost as important for your car make to win as it was for your driver to win, which is a little odd to think about these days. And it still is the fact for some fans today, but not nearly as much then. So that fact became a big part of the rivalry too, Ford versus Chrysler.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think a little less understood by those who aren't sort of big time race fans, right? That allegiance to brand is just as important, sometimes even more so than the actual individual drivers. Or if your favorite driver isn't making it, somebody else on Team Plymouth or, Team Ford could also be easily rooted for and or potentially even help partner in a draft situation or whatever, right? So there's a whole bunch of intrigue that goes just beyond these two drivers. Again, even more incredible that these two would stand out on their own on such a regular basis, and an astonishing. I have to think too that there was a point where, especially given when Winston and RJ Reynolds came into the mix, and the sponsorship stuff and the true gear shift, if you will, from regional to potentially national sports platform, that NASCAR probably wanted to embrace this rivalry as an excuse, especially for the newfound fans that were just coming into awareness of this sport, perhaps via TV.
Yeah, all that was sort of a big package, and it helped when TV and RJ Reynolds kind of became big in the sport, sort of at the same time, that you had this ready-made rivalry of these two guys, and as you mentioned, they're, we don't want to pretend here that they were the only people on the track. I mean, you had Yarborough early on, you had Fireball Roberts, Darrell Waltrip comes along later in the mid 70s, and of course Dale Earnhardt, who became maybe the most popular one of them all. But that was later on. But you have to have superstars. Every sport, you have to have superstars, and these guys were ready when everything sort of exploded with more money and the television product and all. They were there ready to go, and the stories just kind of built on themselves. With Petty's mid North Carolina background and the family business, Lee Petty, the dad, Kyle Petty, the Richard's son, comes along. So you've got a story there, and with Pearson, you've got the, up by the bootstraps kind of story, rags to riches, as it were. Mill Village boy makes good. So there was a lot of stuff in the background that fed the stories along the way about these two guys, particularly when there were more media people around, particularly starting in the 70s, to spread all these stories. So it just all grew on itself.
The you've got a bunch of different stories and about particular races, but maybe a couple of some of the more memorable clashes that these two had, which is interesting because upon reflection, a handful of them, probably the most memorable happened in the 70s, which also happened to coincide with growing media coverage, inclusive of television coverage. Now, I think people also forget too, as I load this question up further, ABC, through their Wide World of Sports franchise at the time, would inject either taped coverage of NASCAR races or on occasion try to even squeeze in portions of a live broadcast so that they could maybe squeeze in the final or the end of a race during their 2-hour Wide World of Sports window, which, by the way, sounds pretty convenient if there was an expectation that these two guys would be there then near the end, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's worth mentioning that despite the attractions of stock car racing, the personalities and the color, the speed, and let's not forget the danger involved, television was really, really shy about jumping in with both feet, in part because most of the races were so long, 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours, that the fear there was, we can't televise an entire race. We can't hold people's interest across that span of time. And it's clear that the races, however entertaining they might be at the finish or or at various times during the race, they're not going to be thrilling every lap. You're not going to have television viewers on the edge of their seat for four and a half hours of a race. So finally, CBS decided to take the big chance and go with flag to flag coverage for the 1979 Daytona 500. And a lot of people listening to this will remember or have read about what happened there with the crazy finish on the last lap with Kel Yarborough and Donnie Allison crashing, racing for the win, and opening the door for Petty to win the race. And the television numbers were up in large part because a lot of the East Coast was snowed in that weekend. People couldn't get out. They watched TV. This strange thing called NASCAR was on TV. Let's watch it, see what it's about. And wham, you had this tremendous finish. Cale and Donnie fighting in the mud in the third turn after they crashed. A big moment for the sport. A lot of people consider that finish the best finish at Daytona, maybe in NASCAR history. I tend to disagree. I picked the 1976 Daytona 500.
Well, let's talk about that one, because I was going to just say that the pretty darn good one there 2 years earlier, which just happened to also be, I think it was part of the Wide World of Sports dynamic, was actually broadcast live on ABC. I don't think they had the whole race, but they got in for quite a bit of time and to see. Maybe you describe it.
Yeah, ABC came in for the last portion of the race, which happened occasionally across those years. But this one, and this was the first Daytona 500 that I covered. It came down, as so often in those days, to Petty and Pearson, and they're racing side by side out of the fourth turn on the last lap with the checkered flag in view. And of course, they crash, and their cars start spinning, and they both spun onto the infield grass, or the grass between the racetrack and pit road. And those of us sitting in the press box, and I'm sure a lot of people in the grandstand that day, and maybe on TV too, thought that Richard's car was going to spin all the way across the finish line and he would win the race in very dramatic fashion. But it fell off the banking onto the grass, as Pearson's car also had. The difference became Pearson had the state of mind to keep the clutch on his car depressed, thus keeping the engine alive. He comes to a stop and pushes the accelerator and chugs across the finish line at maybe 30 miles per hour to win the Daytona 500. Calamity ensued. The people in the grandstands were jumping and screaming. People in the press box, which didn't really have that great a view back in that time, people in the press box were standing on the counters. I remember this vividly. Standing on the counters in the press box to get a better view of what was going to happen and what did happen. To me, that finish is the greatest ever because it put the two giants of the sport at that time against each other in the biggest race on the last lap, and crazy things happened. And 79 comes along, and it's a different kind of finish, and it was crazily popular too because of what happened. But to me, Petty versus Pearson on that last lap in 76 was the best, and not only because it quite a few years later became a book title for me. So there you go.
I won't fight you on that because, and again, I learn more about this sport as I go back in time, having kind of really gotten hooked on it in the 90s, but we're very much aware of the big races like that Daytona in 79 and probably even seeing some of these races like the quote unquote Southern 500. I know was a big ABC broadcast too in that sort of part-time manner But I would, I absolutely agree that 76 500 finish was, it's crazy because I mean, especially Petty's like spinning like a top. You're like, is that top going to spin over that line, that finish line? And nobody seemed to know, and it certainly didn't look scripted. And frankly, for a minute there, it looks like neither of them are going to finish. Not unlike what transpired in 79. Interestingly, I guess the real interesting component here, and you mentioned this, maybe this is a good cul-de-sac for our conversation. You'd think after a heated battle such as that in 76, would be a really good example of perhaps maybe unlike 1979, where there were fisticuffs after the race. It's interesting. That was really never the case between Petty and Pearson. They were rivals, yes, but it seemed like off the track or maybe even on the track when they're not racing, they got along pretty well and certainly respected each other.
Yeah, they got along great with a couple of flashpoint kind of exceptions. That day in 76, immediately after the finish, there's some kind of questions and anger bubbling up along pit road about, okay, who did what to whom, who caused the wreck. Maybe they both caused the wreck. I talked
I'm sorry. Also, to remind that these guys were kind of dark. That final lap, they were kind of both. Petty passed Pearson, and then Pearson around. It was a battle, right? So I think it's very hard to determine who might have dented or moved into whom.
Oh, absolutely. In preparation for this book, I watched the video sitting across the table from Richard and asking him to kind of analyze what happened. And he's seen it, who knows how many hundreds of times, but he seems to have a new look on it every time. And he says, look there. We just barely touched. In fact, we might not have touched, it might have been the air coming off the car, whatever. So, but after the race, Kyle Petty told me that the guys in the Petty crew, and Kyle was a member of that crew as a kid, basically. He said, "Hey, we're ready to go to Victory Lane and fight. We're ready. Let's go." And after Richard's car crashed and stopped on that grassy area, a lot of the team members ran out to push his car, which was improper under the rules, and he lost a lap because of that. But Kyle told me that Richard recognized the anger among the team, whether it was properly placed anger or not. And he told them, hey, and I described this in the book, I think, go back to the garage, get the car ready. We're going to Rockingham next week. We have to have the car ready. This race is over. Don't worry about it. And so there was no real confrontation. A couple of the Petty team members ran alongside Pearson's car as he drove down pit road after the cool down lap. And I'm sure some pleasantries were exchanged for those few seconds. But, nobody ran to Victory Lane to challenge David, or there was, whatever minor disgruntlement there might have been was gone quickly, and they raced like normal the next week at Rockingham.
Yeah, and I think there's that's probably rooted in mutual respect, right? Because there's theses out there about competitiveness and needing somebody else to challenge you to kind of make you do better versus just sort of running away with it all on your own or getting complacent. It does feel to me, perhaps along those lines, that the fact that these guys were and their teams and their owners were so solid in their preparation and their abilities on the track that they kind of got the best out of each other, and frankly, maybe benefited from the other's existence.
Oh, no question about that. As they did from racing with Yarborough and Allison and Waltrip and later Earnhardt. These people didn't show up at the racetrack just to race and have fun. There were any number of teams which did not have a lot of resources, and they'd show up and they'd be absolutely thrilled to get a top 10 or top 15 finish. But for the Petties, for Pearson, for the Wood brothers, racing was about, there's only one position that we want to be in at the end, and that's first. So often they describe second place as the first loser. I've heard David say that many times over the years. He would certainly accept a second place check, but other than that, second place was no better than 15th. And the Petties approached it much the same way. After a race was over, if they won a race on Sunday, the celebration of that ended at midnight that night. Early the next morning, they were at the shop in Level Cross, North Carolina, working on the car for the next week. It was great to win. We enjoyed it. We celebrated. We took home the trophy and all that. But okay, that part's over. We got to do all this again next week, and we start working on Monday morning for that.
Were they friends in the true sense of the word, or were they just mutually admiring of each other and their skills?
No, they were very much friends, and I think that relationship got deeper over the years. They're over their closing driving years, but also after they both retired from driving. Everything's a lot more casual and easier then, and they often hung out together at racetracks. Richard was at every race after he quit driving. Obviously, he's still in team ownership. Pearson showed up occasionally. And, it was a grand time in the garage. They shared stories about the old days. And Petty would remember beating Pearson by 2 laps somewhere at North Wilkesboro or whatever. And Pearson would say, no, that was much closer at the end than that. And they had meals together. Their family, their kids grew up together. When they would race in Daytona in the summer, they would stay at the same motels, and their kids would play in the pools together. Pearson had 3 boys, Ricky, Larry, and Eddie, and Richard, of course, with his son Kyle and daughters. They were together so much that their families were close. They would play in the infield at racetracks, flop around in the mud holes and race together from one end of the infield to the next. It was racing, stock car racing in particular, has often been known as a quote family unquote sport, and in their cases that was really the case. The Pearson sons and Richard's son all stayed involved in racing, drove race cars. So it was they could beat each other fender to fender on the racetrack, but eat sandwiches and hot dogs together afterward. It was that kind of relationship.
All right, here's my last sort of wind-up question then. And we kind of danced around this a little bit when we were last together back in our episode number 300, our celebration of the 75th anniversary of NASCAR. If you haven't listened to that episode, by all means, what are you waiting for? Do you think that NASCAR could ever see such a rivalry, and perhaps arguably is it in need of it, given the advent of specialization and super speedways? And there seems to be a lack of that, right? It's for me as a largely a fan, it's very hard for me to find even a villain or somebody to root against at this point. The names almost feel almost interchangeable for me. I wonder if the sport could use a good dose of a rivalry such as the Petty Pearson legacy, or is that wishful thinking because it was a different era, a different time, and I shouldn't project that wish on the realities of what the sport is today?
Well, one thing that's made that more difficult in current times is that so many drivers now are winners. It's relatively rare for a driver to win 7, 8, 10 races or more in a year, which was in a way commonplace back in the day. So you don't have a situation where 1 or 2 or 3 drivers are fighting each other every week for wins. A driver might win 1 week and wait 6 weeks to the next win. I think NASCAR and in some cases the media have tried to, in effect, create rivalries over the years. Kyle Petty points out in a part of this book that a couple of drivers can have a crash on the track and after the race argue fiercely and push each other around maybe and things like that. And he says the media wants to automatically say, wow, this is a big rivalry. But as Kyle points out, one race doesn't make a rivalry. 10 or 15, 20 years of racing together, that's what makes a rivalry. So I think it's harder today because there are so many different winners. The sport has been sanitized in a lot of ways because of, big sponsors don't like fights. They don't like controversy. There certainly have been villains. Kyle Busch sticks out, although he is much less than that these days.
Yeah, I mean, I heard him a week ago or something in the broadcast booth. He was actually, I wanted to hate him more. He was actually quite good. I mean, that's, I don't know.
Yeah, well, you look at a guy like Denny Hamlin. Denny is purposely tried to be the villain. He famously, after he wins a race, he will yell to the crowd during the TV interview, I beat your favorite driver. And of course, the boos will cascade down. But there hasn't been one-on-one driver A versus driver B. That kind of rivalry just hasn't developed. A lot of people tried to say that Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon were that. But you look back at the records, those two guys really didn't race each other a lot for wins. They were essentially buddies. They were business partners, in fact. So they're not at each other's throats every week after a race. It wasn't that kind of thing. So I think that the general atmosphere of the sport now is not such that those one-on-one kind of rivalries can develop. You're just not going to see the same two guys racing for the win week after week after week, generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, the in-season tournament thing is a noble attempt, I guess, at least having some week-to-week, 3 versus 17 kind of battles and that kind of stuff. I'm not too sure that's going to sort of generate it either. But I guess what I'm hearing you say is you can't manufacture this, and maybe it has to happen organically if it can happen at all, given parity and the next gen car and all that kind of stuff, where the sport and maybe television and the sponsors want, even competitiveness week in and week out versus anything approaching dominance or, too much success for 1 or 2 drivers.
Yeah, the landscape is just not set up for that. You have 4 or 5 really good teams with several drivers on each team. So you're going to have a lot of different winners. And like I said, there just isn't the environment for the one-on-one kind of racing that we saw fairly often back in the 60s and 70s among drivers like Pearson, Petty, Yarborough, Waltrip coming along later, Bobby Allison. There just isn't the landscape to produce that. Not to say it can't happen, but it's much more unlikely than in the Petty Pearson days.
All right, last question. Are you hopeful though for the sport? I mean, obviously this is a rich part of the history, and I think, frankly, anybody who's a current generation NASCAR fan maybe has heard stories, but should truly understand, this is one of the through lines of the history upon which today's racing and today's sport sort of stand. How do you feel about NASCAR these days in terms of its health, potentially some antitrust stuff coming up if Michael Jordan's team still has the legal capabilities there? The tracks seem to kind of come and go. The experimentation seems to be ramping up. What's your sense of it? I mean, you've been covering this for a long time. Do you feel optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in between? Too many sports out there and competing for people's attention. What of NASCAR going forward in your mind?
Yeah, I think I'm somewhere in between there. There are certainly reasons to question how big the future is going to be, and that lawsuit is certainly one of them. But it's worth pointing out, and we've talked a lot about the finish of that '76 Daytona 500 with Pearson winning and Petty not. Those two guys crash. If their cars had remained where they were short of the finish line, the third place driver, and I think it was Benny Parsons, was way back on the track. It would have taken a few more seconds or whatever for him to get on around and win the race if Pearson had not been able to keep his car running. Now, in the Daytona 500, that's almost a ridiculous concept because the cars are packed so close together that you're just not going to have a case of the first and second place drivers crashing and us waiting some number of seconds to determine who's going to win the race. The car, 20 cars are packed so close together. You're still having crazy finishes at Daytona, but that's primarily because of these huge crashes over the last 20 laps that take out cars. But you still have a bunch of cars packed together typically when the checkered flag falls.
You'd also probably have a yellow thrown at that point too, right? So there wouldn't be any race to the flag.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I mean, there are great drivers in the sport. There are some really promising drivers coming along, several in the Xfinity series who are promising. But it's all about how far television can carry the sport as it has been doing for a while. It's about how inventive NASCAR can be. I think they've done well in moving the sport around to new places and new tracks. For so long, there were 2 races at almost every track every year. Even when attendance started dropping at some of these tracks, they kept 2 races. NASCAR has taken a much more aggressive approach to that and saying, in effect, hey, people are not showing up at your place. We're going somewhere else. We don't know that we'll get good numbers somewhere else, but we're going to give it a shot. And I think that largely has worked with the Chicago street race. A lot of people don't like it at all, but it's been a winner in Chicago. People thought that will never happen when they announced it. You can't do that, but they've done it for 3 years. First 2 were rain soaked, but they all were generally considered a success. So in Mexico City this year. So they're trying different things and trying to forge a new way around or through some issues. I think there's a lot of work needs to be done on the race car itself to make it more competitive. There's a continuing problem with the aerodynamics and making passing at the front difficult. NASCAR has struggled with that for years, and drivers complain about it. Fans complain about it. There doesn't seem to be an easy answer, but work continues. I'm generally optimistic. I think it's a good sport. There are good people in it. It's ready made for TV. The TV networks have done a good job explaining the sport, coming up with really nice graphics that explain difficult things that are to understand just from the spoken word. The graphics are great. So I think the potential is certainly there for it to continue to do well. for some time to come. But as you say, there are some clouds forming.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would leave you with is sort of a thought on, and I don't know if this antitrust suit is going to ultimately prove successful or even go to trial. But it does speak to, and again, I come at this more from an outsider's perspective than anything. And actually lessons learned from this silly little show over the last number of years. It is interesting that NASCAR, as a major professional league, if you will, is completely still family owned and operated. And you wonder if there were some more, shall we say, outside competitive elements. Now, I think it would be a tall challenge, although there's plenty of private equity money out there looking for things to do, especially in sports, to create a competitive challenger circuit, so to speak. Lord knows there are plenty of tracks that don't have NASCAR races anymore. I think I've seen more pictures and loops from various drivers from various abandoned tracks over the last couple of weeks. I guess my point is that as long as NASCAR and the France family still have this grip, if you will, on their crown jewel, it's their business. The innovation is going to come in fits and starts, and maybe isn't necessarily going to be, coming from the outside. It's almost like they could use a Pearson to their petty, so to speak. But I don't know that, I don't know if that's going to happen per se. There's plenty of other things that can challenge for it, but I don't know. It always feels to me, again, as an outsider, that NASCAR changes begrudgingly and maybe later than most people might imagine if it was truly a more competitive landscape.
Well, what's the one-word answer to every question in sports? It's money. If somebody could come along with a really big TV package and the money to support it, you possibly could see a situation where there could be a rival racing league, stock car racing league, as it were. I don't see that happening. Over the years, particularly in the formative years, of course, NASCAR has been violently opposed to even the thought of any kind of union operation. Bill France Sr., the founder, famously carried a pistol around with him to enforce that thought. Things have changed to a degree on that front with NASCAR developing a driver's council and these kind of things to get more input from drivers and team owners. But still, as you point out, it's a family-owned sport, and that family is in control of 95% of what goes on and where the sport goes and what the rules are and where we're going to race, etc. I don't really see that changing, although as we've talked, there are some kind of dark clouds out there. We'll see how that's all going to turn out with this lawsuit being sort of the focal point coming up later this year, unless things change dramatically between now and then.
All right. Our thanks to Mike. No better motorsports and NASCAR scribe will you find than the great Mike Hembree. Check out all of his stuff on Amazon and various places. You can follow Mike on the socials on both X and Facebook at Mike Hembree. That's Hem as in Mary, Bree, Mike Hembree in both of those places. You can also get a copy of this brand new book called Petty versus Pearson, The Rivalry That Shaped NASCAR, published by Motor Books. Wherever you get good books, your local bookseller, I'm sure, will be more than happy to order it if they don't already have it sitting in their window. But of course, if you'd like to get it as conveniently as possible and give us a couple of shekels of referral love, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and search up this episode numbered 404 with me and Mike, and a couple of links there will take you conveniently to the hardcover, the Kindle, or audiobook versions of this publication. And we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love when you do so that way. We appreciate that. You can also, depending on when you're listening to this episode, go meet Mike in person. If you happen to be in Spartanburg, South Carolina, on July 29th at the Hub City Bookshop, you can meet and greet Mike along with Richard Petty. Yes, they'll be jointly signing copies of this book. So go meet the King and Mr. Mike. Take a picture with him, too. Send it to me. And we'd love to know that you heard about it and through this little show here. We'd appreciate that. And tell them both we said hello. And hopefully you bought a couple of copies for your friends and gotten them signed and personalized, too. Like I said before, goodseatsstillavailable.com, our little locus for all things about this show. Lots more coming up. Check out our merch section. Great stuff there from some of our wonderful sponsors and all kinds of garb for you to consider and purchase. We appreciate you doing that. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com and follow us on the socials, why don't you? Blue Sky, we're at goodseatsstillavailable.com. X, you'll find us at Good Seats Still, and you will find us everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including, by the way, YouTube, where we also stream every episode as well. If you're not somehow getting this on your podcast feeder or catcher or whatever device, you can always stream episodes there as well. 5-star ratings, thumbs up, whatever. We appreciate that wherever you listen. That helps other people find the episodes and the show. Perhaps people like you as well. And tell some friends, why don't you? We appreciate the love. So spread that around. And speaking of love, our peace and love, as Ringo would say, to the great Jerry Payne for his audio excellence this week. Thank you, sir. And thanks for listening, everybody. More to come. Great stuff. Stay tuned to your feeds. And, buckle up again and drive safely.